Hello BRBC, and welcome back to our Christian Apologetics video series. If you're just joining us, we are exploring the rational side of faith so that we can, as the Apostle Peter wrote, always be prepared to give a defense to anyone who asks for the reason for the hope that is in us in Jesus. This is important because we are called to spread the truth of Christ to the world around us, and to do so, it's critical that we can speak about, defend, and commend our faith in a language that our culture can understand. This week, we're going to explore a second argument for the existence of God, the argument for morality. Now, this is a broad and multifaceted argument, so for the purposes of this video, we're going to just focus in on one area, one idea, the notion of the moral law. Simply put, if there is such a thing as an objective moral law, then there must be a moral lawgiver. We all know things that are right and things that are wrong, and some of that is clearly the result of our environment. For example, dogs are better than cats. You should look before you cross the street, and driving on the right side of the road is the right way to do it. These sorts of things. Other things we know to be right or wrong, independent of what side of the ocean we're from or how we grew up. So how do we know that it's unconditionally wrong to torture innocent people, to abuse children, to rape, murder, steal? How do we account for the objective goodness of charity, forgiveness, and compassion? Well, without a moral lawgiver, without God, it's impossible to have an objective moral reality. Without God, all we're left with is morality based on individual feelings and cultural norms. Now, please note, I'm not saying that you must believe in God in order to be moral. Paul makes it clear in Romans 2:14-15 that God's law is written on the hearts of all men, and so we shouldn't be surprised that people of other religions and even atheists can and do live moral lives, sometimes better than we do. What I'm saying, and what the moral argument advocates, is that the source of morality is something greater than ourselves. Now, before we go too much further, it's important to establish the fact that objective morality does indeed exist. This can be demonstrated by considering the alternative, which is subjective morality, known as relativism. Cultural relativists believe that morality results from cultural and societal norms and history, while individual relativists believe that each individual generates his or her own morality as a result of personal experience and preference. In either case, relativism fails to adequately describe our human experience for many reasons, and I'll just touch on one of them here for the sake of time. This is known as the reformer's dilemma. Dr. Douglas Groothuis describes this dilemma, saying, "The notion of making the cultural consensus the moral arbiter leads to an absurdity. Many courageous moral reformers, such as Gandhi, the suffragists, Martin Luther King Jr., opposed a cultural consensus that had been based on long-standing moral views. Their objections to injustices were not based on discerning a broad consensus, but rather by appealing to objective moral principles. According to cultural relativism, King and all other laudatory moral reformers should be condemned as cultural and moral deviants who must be deemed immoral when judged by the extant standards of their societies." C.S. Lewis recognized this also, and in his work, The Abolition of Man, identified that humanity throughout the ages has generally agreed on the ideas of benevolence, duty to family, laws of justice, duties to children, laws of honesty, good faith, mercy, and generosity. Some variant of the golden rule spans most cultures. The reality of an objective morality also explains how God and the Old Testament prophets are able to hold other people and nations accountable for their evils, even though those people and nations hadn't received the law of Moses. So, an objective moral law exists, and this brings up the question, how did objective morality come to be? Atheistic attempts to address objective moral values face a serious problem of origin, because it's not at all clear how such values could simply pop into existence as part of the fabric of an otherwise impersonal and uncaring universe. This is because morality requires a mind. Think about it. If you believe that there is such a thing as evil, then you must admit that there is such a thing as good. If good and evil exist, then you have to assume that there is a means by which you can distinguish and judge between them, an absolute moral law. And if an absolute moral law exists, then there must be a moral lawgiver, God. Why? Because protons and neutrons, hydrogen, gravity, these can't make moral judgments. Only a mind can do that, and only a transcendent mind can provide the origin for an objective moral law. Morality requires God, whether we believe in him or not. Now, I'd like to leave you with one last thought, and I think this is incredibly relevant in our culture, since we affirm the inherent value of all human beings. But why do we do that? I submit to you that a theistic, a God-based approach to morality makes far more sense of this innate value that all people possess than does an atheistic approach. To again quote Dr. Groothuis, "If God does not exist, it is impossible to hold a high moral view of human beings. If humans do not bear the divine image, their worth can only be determined on the basis of their differing abilities and empirical qualities. Morality depends on God. Now, we've only barely scratched the surface of this argument, and there's an amazing amount of complexity and richness that is hard to capture in just a few minutes. So I encourage you to pursue some of the reading suggestions that accompany this video to more deeply understand how morality points to God. Now, at this point, you might be saying, I thought this was a Christian apologetics series. Where's Christ? And you'd be right to make that observation. So far, all we've demonstrated in this series is that there must be a God. But though we've hinted at him, the question still remains, why our God among so many competing worldviews? And don't they all essentially teach the same thing anyway? That's the subject of the next video. See you then.